disinformation campaigns, so the deliberate ones where they're trying to deceive you, they target emotion on purpose. I suspect no. You know, we know from testimony of people who've been released that they're being tortured. Hamas were prepared for it, and I can tell you why I think that. I've seen the overlay of their operational plan.
Good morning, all. Major Andrew Foltz, a very, very warm welcome to you, ex-Para Regiment. It turns out we've served together as well at times throughout our time. Now a specialist in Middle East defence and disinformation. Before we get into a whole raft of stuff, I'm really keen on unpicking this disinformation. We talked a bit about it outside because I think all of us are trying to find the truth, find out what's actually going on. And yet there's so many different voices out there. What does disinformation mean to you, and what's your role in trying to unpack that?
There are two aspects to it, disinformation and misinformation. I think it's important to disambiguate between the two before we start any conversation. So disinformation is incorrect information spread by somebody deliberately. So someone is trying to deceive you for whatever reason it might be, and they're telling you something that is false to convince you of their position. That's disinformation. Misinformation is simply incorrect information. It's a matter of intent. It's the difference between murder and manslaughter, if you think about it in those terms. And the aim of a disinformation campaign is to get ordinary, normal people to spread their misinformation around the place. So you've got to first of all look at the intent underneath it. And there are rafts of it out there. We've seen Russian campaigns targeted in America. We've seen, obviously, the Israel-Gaza war gives us more than we can talk about in an hour, frankly. But disinformation is a designed campaign to try and deceive people.
I just wonder how you unpick that, though, because the world of social media that you and I both operate in, but you certainly do more. It feels like there's a tsunami always of information coming at you. Some of it is looking from a particular perspective on an issue. I remember serving in the Middle East for a while, and people talked a lot about bribery. When I was out in the Middle East, they were called it patronage. And you went, okay, it's different words. They have very emotively different meanings, but they describe the same event. But one is illegal, one is understandable. And therefore, this whole world of, the information, particularly when you talk about conflicts, and we'll get on to, obviously, the war in Gaza, there are such polarised opinions, completely different foundations for the information sets that individuals want to base their arguments on. How on earth do you make sense of that without unpicking those foundations?
Yeah, and that's why it's so effective, because we call it cognitive fluency in psychology. It's you accept that something that's easy and you don't have to think about very much. And if you think about how social media platforms are designed, it's almost as if someone made them to spread this stuff. Because think about X or Twitter. You're scrolling with your thumb and information is flying in front of your eyes at a rate of you moving your finger. YouTube, you can just click on the next video, and whatever platform it is, it just makes it so easy to absorb information. And you and I, we all make about 35,000 decisions a day. Okay, that's on the average human being. I've just made a decision to pick up my water and take a sip. Okay, did I think about it? Not really. Something in my mouth said, your tongue's a bit dry. Brain told me to reach over, pick up cup, take sip, put cup back down again, continue talking. All decisions. We all make 35,000, and you cannot rationally think through every decision you make in a day. Your brain would explode, and you'd never get anything done because it would take you 3 hours to get out of bed in the morning. So the brain looks for easy information because it's already working really hard. And the way to try and pick your way through these complex issues is to stop, read around the subject, think about it, come up with your own conclusions, and then that's how you get to the truth, isn't it? Or as your own truth anyway. But to do that, you need education in how to research properly. You need education in source analysis and working out, what you're reading and why. You probably need a foundational knowledge base before you can just pick something up and start talking about it. And we can't all do that with every single tweet or YouTube video we see. So it makes it incredibly difficult. So the answer, I think, is to pick the stuff you're really interested in and get good at that. But you're still going to be vulnerable to all the other stuff that's out there.
But also you can't possibly keep pace. I mean, it feels like it's a bit like today's news, tomorrow's fish and chip wrapper, but it's almost much tighter timescales than that. Somebody comes out with a narrative. might take you a while, maybe a day, maybe a couple of days, maybe a week, to prove that is not true, by which stage the world has moved on. Nobody gives a monkeys about what that particular line was. So how on earth do you make it relevant without becoming gloriously isolationist? They were wrong. Yeah, a week ago, thanks.
And that's the problem. I think you've nailed it on the head there. And you can see this. And we'll use Israel, Gaza as a good example here, not because I'm a Middle East specialist, but it's just a really perfect example of this. Something happens in Gaza, Hamas put out their press releases straight away. And because most of them are lies, it doesn't really matter what they put in them. They'll go, 50 dead, 200 injured, that'll do, off it goes. That's round the world before the IDF can do their battle damage assessments, before they can, craft a press release, before they can get their evidence packs together. And by the time they've released something 24 hours later, that's gone. That narrative is now out of the stable and bolting around the yards.
But it's also, I think, that because I was at a conference the other day, and they were, for whatever the individuals, they said that Hamas has been quite effective at doing the human part of reporting. The IDF tends to do the much more objective part. And they said, actually, a lot of society, it wants to hear about the objective, but it's the human element that touches people. And if you don't have a narrative around that, then people listen to the only narrative that's out there. And I do wonder how I was criticised at Sky when they had remember when the Kakhovka Dam was blown, and we covered that, and I covered it from a military perspective. And the boss of Sky News pulled me aside over a coffee and said, you weren't very sympathetic to all the farmers. And I went, yeah, because in the big scheme of things, it doesn't matter. This is a war. And he went, oh. But that's what he was interested in. And I do wonder whether or not that's another part of this information, that if you're playing the agenda of actually looking at the human element of this.
Sorry, mate.
No, I was say, where does it go? Because unless it matters, unless we can do something about it, then maybe the subject is just intellectually, sort of stimulating and interesting. Because, for example, what I've heard, if I get into a discussion with somebody about this particular subject, some people's answer is to do what the BBC have done, come up with, BBC Verify. In other words, we are the sole holders of the truth, and we will tell you when you're wrong and when you're right, and therefore what you can consume safely and what you can't. And for me, that is just not the answer. So we know to educate the world in the way that you've said, to make people reasonable, to make them thorough, ask a question in 5 different ways from 5 different sources, and then arrive at, well, maybe not the conclusion, but your own conclusion. Actually, to get people to do that in this world where everything moves at the pace of your thumb, which you said, it's tricky, isn't it? So what the hell can we do?
Yeah, it's tricky and almost impossible, actually. But just to go back to your point, I think I'll come back to you in a second, but I think the first point is really important, is that disinformation campaigns, so the deliberate ones where they're trying to deceive you, they target emotion on purpose. That is absolutely what they're trying to activate. So if you think about the 2 thinking systems in your brain, one's from the amygdala, one's from the prefrontal cortex. So one here, one kind of deeper inside. Amygdala is what controls your stress reaction. So it puts you into fight or flight. When you have an experience that is, scary or upsetting, that's the bit of the brain that kicks in. It pushes out all the relative stress hormones. But what all that also does is suppress your prefrontal cortex, which is the rational thinking bit of the brain. So a disinformation campaign is trying to make you not think rationally. That's why they go hard on pictures of dead children and similar awful stuff. It's designed to get an emotional reaction rather than make you stop and go, actually, I need to think this through, etc. This is legal, good airstrike, sad, tragic collateral damage. This is where all these things happen. And just as your dam example goes, it's exactly the same thing. That is a very heartless reaction because it's not thinking with your heart, it's thinking with your mind. That doesn't mean you can't go, wow, that's awful that a child has died. But you have to then unpack that and look at the circumstances around it. And so disinformation is trying to stop you from doing that. How do we counter it? Much more tricky. I think awareness of people trying to emotionally engage you is probably the first step, actually. So that's why I've answered it in that way, because I think they're connected. If you are conscious of an emotional reaction and you have the emotional intelligence to understand your own emotional self-regulation, that's probably the first part. So we don't even need to educate people on the wider issues. you actually need to educate people about themselves. It's like, has my heart rate just picked up? Am I feeling a bit more tense than I was 30 seconds ago before I saw this thing I've just seen? And if you're getting an emotional reaction, then that's probably the starting point to suggest that somebody's trying to manipulate you. Or it could just be that you've seen a picture of a dead child and you're naturally horrified. That's the other
It just
aspect.
feels this is one of those that we're going to end up talking about, I think, a fair bit. And there is a science behind it. But it feels like people are being played at the moment. And I don't know how you break that cycle because... But going back to... let's look at Gaza in particular. I mean, obviously, our attention focused on from the 7th of October. Clearly, things didn't start then. But this has been going on, the war, since 7th of October. It's fallen off the radar a bit in terms of the news, only probably because of domestic pressures and other things going on. But the war is trundling on out there. You've recently visited, haven't you? What's your take on what's going on at the moment?
It's also less exciting out there at the moment because they've moved from kind of the high-intensity fighting phase of the operation to the reactive strike phase of the operation. So if you think about Gaza as a rectangle, they did the bit at the top first, the bit in the middle second, and now they're just finishing off at the bottom, which is where the Egyptian border is. They've not used Western tactics. I think that's really important to emphasise when you're analysing this. They've not tried to do counterinsurgency. They've not tried to do counter-terrorism. They're fighting a war against a terror army that has a chain of command, defensive positions, a defensive plan, down to the fighter and the amount of ammunition in each position. You know, this is a very detailed and well-led terror army, and they fought them as an army. So that's a really important framing. Obviously, it's less striking and less dramatic now they've moved out of the high intensity phase. They're still conducting raids in various bits of the strip as intelligence drives them to do so. They've only got 2 brigades in Rafah now. They've got a 3rd brigade just outside Rafah where they rotate them through every few weeks, because obviously the troops have been at this for 10 months now. Pretty high intensity for some of it. There's that kind of moral aspect to keeping soldiers fresh for the field. But it's not exciting looking at somebody drilling for tunnels and then blowing them up with liquid explosive.
But they were recently back into Khan Yunis again, didn't they?
There were another
active,
raid,
and they still haven't got... Yahya Sinwar still is elusive as ever. So a lot of debate about how many of the fighters still exist, what proportion of the tunnel network is still in the hands of Hamas. I understand the intent, I think, of the Israelis, but do you think that's ever actually going to be achievable?
I mean, they're talking about another 6 to 18 months of this if there's no ceasefire. I think people are rushing to judgment before the operation's finished. I think it's going to plan roughly. I mean, they have total freedom of movement within the entirety of Gaza. There's no part of Gaza that the IDF can't touch right now, and that's a really good waypoint in a military campaign. We never had that in Iraq or Afghanistan. You know, we were IED'd to pieces every time we tried to move. So they've done better than we have on that front. Where I think they might fall over is the sheer level of damage that destroying the tunnels and destroying the booby traps is going to cause. It's every other house. That's really challenging. Yes, it's a good military objective, but is it a workable human objective for the people who then have to reconstruct the place and the poor Palestinians who are stuck in tents on the beach in the middle of a Mediterranean summer? There's a really big human factor to weigh up here. So I think their plan's good. I think if they keep doing what they're doing, they will destroy most of the tunnels. They will kill most of Hamas's leadership. I suspect. No. I think the two war aims are mutually exclusive.
And that's
You can either get the hostages back or you can destroy Hamas.
Yeah.
Because just think about the logic. If you don't give Hamas an exit, what incentive do they have to give you the hostages back?
No.
It doesn't make any sense. So,
and that's why this whole business about negotiation, as you and I both know, you only negotiate if you're in a stalemate or if one side's won.
Yeah.
Well, this doesn't feel that we've settled into either of those yet. And unless the Palestinian question was on the table for Hamas, I don't see any reason for them to walk away. And until the Israelis have achieved their objective, why would they negotiate? There was a period where I wondered whether the pressure on getting the hostages out might be enough to force Netanyahu to abate somewhat. But
I mean, I think the longer we go down the line, not the less relevant the hostages will be, but the less of a bargaining chip Hamas will be able to have to use them for, because we know from testimony of people who've been released that they're being tortured in some instances. We know there's 115 left in there, and the estimate is about 40 to 45 of those are dead.
Yeah.
As time goes on, those figures are going to get worse and worse and worse, where Israel will always want the bodies back. That's an item of Jewish faith, and that's a religious issue almost. Well, actually, it's a religious issue.
Yeah.
So that's a really tricky one for the Israelis to work their way through. And if I'm honest, I don't have a solution to that.
But it's also, genuinely, because having been out there, if I can't see a way in which Israel wins, and by that destroyed Hamas. There's no, Hamas is an ideology and whatever. So at what point, once it goes from weeks to months to potentially you're implying years, when does it end? How do you finally draw a line under the offensive stage of this?
Yeah.
And start to do the rebuilding phase? You and I both spent time in war zones where the number of civilian casualties, just because of the lack of food or the lack of medical care or the lack of, gradually that is going to overtake the casualties of war, and it's just difficult to see how you transition from the destructive phase to the rebuilding phase until this period of conflict is over, and I can't see when that is likely to be.
Yeah, the paper was published this week where they're proposing this UAE-led coalition. I'm not sure that's anything more than a fantasy at this point. There's no issue with aid going into Gaza. I think that's important to raise. There's more calories per day going in than there were before the war. Aid distribution in a war zone, though, is the issue. And frankly, the international community haven't done enough, and they've done a lot of blaming of Israel for their own failings, I suspect. 16,000 humanitarian aid coordinations with the IDF, 10 out of those 16,000 have ended up in a shooting incident by accident. So, it's not as if the Israelis are the ones shooting aid convoys. So who is? Have a guess. It's the other side, but you wouldn't get that reported particularly fairly in the West. When we look at reconstruction efforts, though, and when we look at what the end state looks like, I think Hamas is an ideology is a slightly lazy way to look at it, actually. I think the better way to look at it is the Palestinian cause is an ideology, and that's not going anywhere. They still will see Israel as oppressors and colonizers. Obviously, I don't agree that that's true, but that's their perspective. And the only way to change that is going to be through sort of a mass multi-generational re-education almost. And that's something I'm not very comfortable with, because it feels an awful lot like forced brainwashing. Like, how do you force someone to believe? So I've said from the start, I've said it from last October, and if you don't believe me, you can check my Twitter, that I think this is just another blip in a pretty endless conflict. It's a violent spike in a conflict that's just not going anywhere.
But what about the theory then that says that we've tended to be looking west at Gaza? If you look east towards the West Bank, and what's been happening there over time, even Israel agrees some of what's going there is illegal. But if you look at it from far enough away, it looks like an effort to gradually cleanse that area. And the danger is you were drawn to the conclusion that if a two-state solution, which was something that the West, America, lots of people assumed was the right answer, Netanyahu's been pretty clear that's not the answer. If you look at what's going on, it will be easy to conclude that the answer is a one-state solution. Is that how you see this playing out?
No, I think it's going to stay as it is. I think it's just going to be a frozen conflict. I don't think they're ethnically cleansing. Palestinian population in Israel has been going, in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip has been, going up gradually every single year. There aren't fewer Palestinians than there were previously. The Knesset has, actively said they're not doing a two-state solution. But also there's a case to say that why should they be forced to it if the other state in that two-state solution is still committed to destroying the first state? That's still in Hamas's charter. You look at the stuff Fatah are pushing out, they're almost no better than Hamas. It does take two to tango. And this problem all goes away if Palestinians just go, cool, okay, Israel's yours. We'll have these areas. We're going to turn Gaza into a new Dubai. We can sort out the West Bank in slow time. job done. But they won't do that. They're adamant that Israel must be destroyed, Jews must go away.
But what's the role of Iran in all this then?
Yeah, so I mean, Iran is...
Because we're labelling the Palestinians... The reason I'm asking the question,
Yeah.
we sort of say it's the Palestinians' fault. You go, how much of this is the dark shadow of Iran?
Yeah, I mean, they've been pushing Hezbollah's line since the 80s. They've realised that they're weak militarily, and so they've gone for an option of surrounding Israel with their proxies. I think we're on Iraqi militias equal to in size the Iraqi army. This is a really big force they've got in Iraq, which obviously threatens Western assets. So it's a little bit quieter than the others because they don't want to push America too far into striking them. You've got Hezbollah Lebanon, bits of Hezbollah Syria, and then all the other mad groups that are still there in the aftermath of that civil war. Houthis in Yemen, Hamas are an ally, not a proxy. They're not Iranian funded directly. They don't like each other very much. They completely severed relations over ISIS. But now obviously Hamas are fully back in the Iranian fold. And all of this is to try and stop Iran's sort of tactical weakness. They don't have a good army. They don't have a good air force. But what they do have is a great network of proxies who, thanks to the Iran deal with Mr. Obama and Mr. Biden, now have an awful lot more cash to throw around than they used to and arm them slightly better. So Iran are trying to find regional hegemony. They are exploiting the disaster that was the Iraq War, where we unbalanced a very finely balanced region. Saudi Arabia and UAE are on the kind of the good side, which I never thought was something I'd ever say. But
that's what time has sort of healed, hasn't it? I mean, over the years, after, Israeli state was formed, the next day, war erupted. Then gradually, you've had Egypt, you've had Jordan, we're on the cusp of Saudis starting to go, actually, we recognise the state of Israel. All of a sudden, that isolated Iran even more. And as you say, I guess my question is more about, when we talk about the Palestinians and Israelis and everybody focuses on that, if actually the inciter to this violence, the catalyst for the problem actually lies in Iran, how do you isolate Iran from the problem to then create the conditions where you can do Gaza becomes a different organisation, that actually you find some route where both the Israelis and the Palestinians have hope, both have prosperity, both have a future? Because otherwise we're just going to perpetuate this same...
But it goes bigger than that as well. Actually, the world is a chessboard. Everything on it is a piece, and the two players are the USA and China. That's the biggest picture of all if we zoom out to the max. The Chinese side, if we look at that, you've got the alignment of Russia, you've got the alignment of Iran, you've got the alignment of possibly North Korea, who are doing a fair bit of shell production for Russia's fight in Ukraine. And these things are inextricably linked. They're an arm wrestle for global dominance. And yes, Iran is playing its own little mini game in the middle of this, trying to establish their power in the Middle East. But actually, it's much broader than that. So it's very hard to cut Iran without dealing with Russia and China as well, because there's raft of Russian interference in the Palestine issue. Right back to the PLO, USSR funded Arafat. That's where the narrative entirely changed. It's basically a KGB subversion operation. Palestine as a country was never really thought about until the 60s. They were Arab refugees, and that was about that. But then all of a sudden, they've got their own charter, they've got their own flag, they've got their own narrative about how they ended up where they are. The Nakba, not mentioning the fact that they simply lost a war and fled, or that they were left their homes in anticipation of victory in a war that didn't come. They take no ownership of some of their own poor decision making. So it's this is such a complex and difficult subject to unpack, and I don't think you can narrow it down to just saying it's all Iran's fault, or just saying it's all Russia's fault, or just saying it's all Israel's fault, or just saying it's all the Palestinians' fault.
And I think the final bit from my perspective is that Netanyahu's found himself in a very difficult position at times here. Occasionally the narrative appears to be, that it's a fight for his personal survival. And that really worries me, if that, that everything that goes on shouldn't be about one individual's ego. It should be wider than that. How is Netanyahu's position secure? How do you think he'll emerge out of all of this?
I just find it deeply strange that people think that Israel are the ones prolonging the war here. It's just such a bizarre take. They were attacked on 7th of October, had 1,200 of their civilians massacred. The same day, they were met with thousands of rockets from Lebanon that have caused 60 to 70,000 people to be internally displaced within Israel itself. Those rocket attacks have continued to the tune of over 7,000 missile strikes since 7th of October. And yet Israel is somehow the one prolonging the war, or Netanyahu is prolonging the war for his own ends. It's just such a strange take. They've told us from the start what they want to do. They want to dismantle Hamas. They want to get their hostages back. They want to secure their borders. They've said this consistently since day one, and they haven't achieved any of those things yet. And not for lack of trying. The IDF have put 300,000 troops through Gaza so far in rotation. They're trying to do the three things they told us they were going to do in October last year. So the idea that they're somehow artificially extending the war for Bibi's political survival, I find very strange.
But I'm going to challenge you with a bit of the information type stuff here, because I think what was fascinating, even, and it's trying to get what the truth is, but even Yahya Sinwar, by all accounts, was surprised at the reaction of Israel to the 7th of October. As a student of history, you look at the various times that things have happened between Israel and Hamas, and the IDF involved, and they all are generally measured, as we're seeing with Hezbollah, a measured reaction. So we're going to go in, kill a load of people, heinous acts, but whether they ever thought that would trigger the response that they've currently had to this, whether right or wrong, it's not for me to judge, but it's been some of the reaction from America, some from outside, has sort of gone, okay, you've made some choices here, Israel, to go, we're going to deal with this problem for good now, rather than just do a measured reaction. And I think that's part of the backdrop to this. It followed a cycle. That cycle has been broken. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying I think that there's been a very different reaction that's led to huge number of casualties, huge amount of devastation, and a very reasonable question that says the objectives of getting the hostages back, how's that been going? And I agree with you, it's mutually exclusive to their other aims. So why keep saying it? To actually destroy Hamas. Is that possible? Ideological question.
Destroy is not the word in Hebrew, and I think this has been quite a lot of a problem with perception, is that Hebrew is an exceptionally nuanced language. The word Netanyahu used was mitut, which kind of means take apart, dismantle. It doesn't mean destroy in the sense that we would understand it in English. So if you're trying to dismantle Hamas, what you're talking about is deleting their fighting capability and hopefully their governance capability. And that's going quite well, in fairness to the IDF. The response from Israel, Hamas were prepared for it, and I can tell you why I think that. I've seen the overlay of their operational plan. They were firmly set up to defend an Israeli assault from east to west. And if you look at how they're laid down, it's an absolutely recognisable defensive position, interlocking arcs of fire, full-back positions. It's all there. It's everything certainly I, as an infantryman, would recognise as a defensive scheme and manoeuvre. The IDF completely outflanked them. They came in from the north instead, went down the coast and then turned left eastwards, and basically hit them in their rear areas. They were completely dislocated. And yes, whilst IDF strategy has its flaws, and I agree, IDF tactical application has possibly been more violent than it needed to be. I agree with that as well. But in the middle, their operational design has been outstanding throughout. So I think, if we take Bibi's statement in the original Hebrew to dismantle, the hostages, we've already talked about what a strategic conundrum they are, and border security, these three things are what Israel's trying to achieve. And you might not think they're a realistic goal, but they do. And I think they've surprised us on a couple of occasions through this operation already. And they're telling us it's going to take 6 to 18 months more if they don't get a ceasefire deal. So, it's not as if Israel haven't told us what they're doing. So to go back to the original point, whilst I'm not particularly a Netanyahu fan, the idea that he's the one that's torpedoing ceasefire talks, he's the one extending the war, I think that's a disinformation attack on him, or at least a really savage misunderstanding of what's actually happening.
Given we've got a new government in the UK, whether what they say or do will have any impact at all on what Israel does or not, what do you think the response of the new Labour government's going to be?
I've got numbers of Jewish friends, and they're all expressing dismay at the way Labour are handling this at the moment. And I just tell them, what on earth did you expect? You know, Starmer's government, less recognising the state of Palestine, which I suspect is coming, towards Israel, Starmer's government are behaving exactly as I would have expected Corbyn's to behave. You know, they have no interest in being friends of Israel whatsoever. Fortunately for Israel, the UK is basically an irrelevance. We don't give them enough arms. I mean, so we cut arms sales. Well done. Now we've damaged our relationship with someone who's giving us excellent intelligence. You know, great move. Impact on Israeli operations, pretty much zero. You know, the only relationship that matters for Israel is the USA. And there's no indication that Israel and the USA are splitting apart here. There's political rhetoric on the American side, but actually in practice, SOCOM and the IDF are in lockstep when it comes to what they're doing at the moment.
Okay. Can I go back to something we discussed earlier, which was, or implication behind what we discussed, which is whose responsibility is it to fix the nation after a war? Yeah. In other words, it's a provocative question in a way. I don't have an answer, but I think it is a question. So whose responsibility is, you mentioned every other house had to be dismantled to get to the tunnels. So by all accounts, what you saw when you went to Gaza was complete devastation.
Yeah, certainly in the bits they've cleared through.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is it the responsibility of Israel to take account of the need for what we call winning the peace, if you like? Well, if winning the peace means to rebuild the infrastructure of the country that's been under attack, is it their responsibility to do that, to plan it, to think about it? Or is this just war and then you come and attack me, I'm going to attack you, the fact you're wiped out? Is there a reality in this somewhere?
I think that's potentially looking at it through the wrong end of the telescope. Rather than looking at who's responsible, I think the sensible thing to do is look through history and find out what's worked and what hasn't worked. And then we can come to a discussion about who employs what tactics in Gaza to conduct reconstruction once the war is over. And I think there are two good examples from history I'd pull out. The first being the US Civil War, where rather than a sensible reconstruction, what we saw was endless political fighting between the president and the Congress. Nobody giving clear political direction, and as a result, we found political vortices in the southern states, and the Confederates were effectively able to retake control without firing a shot. So you can make a very good case to say that the Union won the Civil War but lost the Reconstruction. That's what we don't want to happen. We can also look at what we tried in Iraq, where a very similar mistake was made. We decapitated the Ba'ath Party, and then there was no governance in Gaza. We had elections, at which point Islamists got elected, and they were then able to essentially fight a turf war with us stuck in the middle. And here we are with Iran basically having Iraq as a client state now. So we don't want to do that either. That's a really bad idea too. Where's it gone really well? Well, Germany, 45. Yes, we were denazifying, but also we were quite sensibly kind of keeping the ones who we could work with. We didn't leave them with a lack of governance. We surged money into the place, enabled them to reconstruct, and here we are with Germany as back to being a regional superpower, effectively. Other examples: Libya, decapitation with no reconstruction. Now that's basically the Wild West. Yeah. And so we've got countless examples through history of failing to do this well. So let's learn from that. Sorry, go on.
Well, I'm saying less of a moral issue then, more of a political issue.
Yeah, I mean, look, what's your end state? Yeah. It's the same as a military campaign. What do you want to achieve with this reconstruction? Yeah. Do you want to create a place where the people that still hate you, i.e. if you're Israeli, the Palestinians, where they can crack on and do what they do, and then in 20 years we have another Hamas who are going to do the same? Or do we want a reconstruction where we thrust money into education and building them up to understanding that the only future for them is if they coexist peacefully with their neighbours? There's so many options on the table here, and the question of who does it is secondary, I think, to what you actually want to achieve. Can the IDF achieve a permanent occupation of Gaza, running re-education schools? No, they absolutely can't. International community won't allow it, and it won't work anyway, and they don't have the troops for it. So if the international community, if the UN wants this place rebuilt, they're going to have to come to something that's amenable to Israel amenable to the Palestinians, and gets us to a point where we can have peaceful coexistence between the two. That's a huge ask. That's a huge ask.